So you're here for Hidden History. And I want to first say I'm so thankful that you're doing this with us. I really appreciate it. I also want to offer that I am a naturalist by profession, not a historian or an architect, a planner, or a landscape architect. I don't even play one on television. So I hope that I get this all right, and use the chat if you want to keep me honest. I can't see the chat right now, but once I come out of the slides, I will go to chat and see what your comments are. But I want to thank David Contosta for this book, A Philadelphia Family, the Houstons and Woodwards of Chestnut Hill. And you can see it's all got these pink slips of paper coming out of it. So I want to thank a lot of the source material that comes from here. Benny Meigs is a member of the Houston family, which we'll be talking about. Benny was on our board, the Schuylkill Center's board. And his stories about this inspired this talk. Hidden City Philadelphia is one of my favorite websites. Got extraordinary stories about the history of Philadelphia. They published an article on this that was incredibly helpful. And Adam Levine, who gave last week's talk on Roxborough's connection to water, historic connections to water. Adam gave me some of his maps too. So I want to thank Adam for his help in putting these together as well. So here we go. And somehow in this story of the Schuylkill Center's 340 acres of land in Upper Roxborough, we're going to pull together the United Nations in New York City, the Twa Flight Center, built in 1962 by Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen. This is on what was then Idlewild Airport, iconic in modern architecture. Cooperate, there we go. Temple University on North Broad Street plays a small role, as does the Barnes Foundation in Marion Station on the main line. So somehow the story of the Schuylkill Center's land will bring all these things together, which is quite remarkable, and why I wanted to tell this. So I want to begin with an 1848 map of Roxborough. This is really a fun map. I know that a lot of the writing is really small, so it's probably hard for you to read. You can see the Schuylkill River flowing across the bottom of the slide, and you can see the Wissa Hicken with its topography at the top of the slide.
Your slide presentation is not working, Mike.
It's not working?
No.
Wait, can anybody else? Can anybody else see? Can any?
No.
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 You're not seeing my slides.
Not
That's
at all.
correct.
Well, it's there, but it's not moving.
You saw your desktop, but not the slide presentation.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that will be, hang on.
What you want to use?
Do you see it now? Do you see my slides?
You see the whole thing with your stuff down with the
beautiful
thumbnails down the left side, but that's not how it ought to be.
No, I know. I just want to make sure you see something.
Yes.
Well, we saw something before, but it wasn't moving. And
all right.
Yeah.
How's that?
There you go.
That's better. That's
all
good.
Right. So now you got it?
Yep.
All right, so I switched from Google Slides to PowerPoint, and something wasn't happy in there. So my screen was happy, but I'm glad you yelled. Thank you so much, everybody. All right, so there's the UN. We're going to pull into this story. Here's the TWA Flight Center, designed by Eero Saarinen in 1962, Temple University on North Broad, and the Barnes Foundation. Here we go. Thank you all. And here's the 1848 map, again with the Schuylkill River at the bottom, Wissa Hicken Creek across the top. Now, Sandy, I can see you, so you can nod if you tell me. Do you see my cursor, my arrow on the left of this? Yay, thank you, Sandy. So Sandy's gonna help me. I appreciate it. So my cursor is on the left. This is the land of the Schuylkill Center right here, and there are two creeks that flow down through the Schuylkill Center. So this rectangle of property, here is the old Hagee's Mill, or the current Hagee's Mill Road right here, which makes this funny bend. Ridge Avenue. So this is, again, 1840. And now look at all of the houses along Ridge Avenue, and look how few there are off of Ridge Avenue. So, of course, Manayunk is well developed, but in here, there's not a lot. But around the Schuylkill Center, interesting, though there's not much today, look at these farmsteads that are all dotted around here. We actually have names for those two streams that flow through the Schuylkill Center, and this one of them arises in the middle of our property and flows right to the Schuylkill River. Another arises just above Hagee's Mill Road under the filtration beds of the city of Philadelphia and goes to the Schuylkill. These are called first order streams. They arise and then go right to the river. Nothing else. A first order stream, if it hits another creek, it becomes a second order stream. So the Wissa Hicken, for example, might be a second, even third order stream, if that makes sense. So one of the things that we talk about at the Schuylkill Center is we have two of the very few first order streams left. Now look at all these streams flowing through this section of Roxborough. There's just a bunch of, every valley has a little stream flowing through it. Many of them have become culverted and diverted. Green Tree Run is still here, the one that goes along Shawmut, as many of you know. But this one we've been calling Meigs Run. I'm sorry, Smith Run. This one, Meigs Run. These are the two streams named for the founding families that we'll talk about in a minute. But what I appreciate is the Keach family has a homestead here, and this is called Keach's Run in 1848. We never thought it was named, but in 1848, the little stream on our property was Keach's Run, and Hagee's Mill Road down here was Keach's Lane. So Keach was a big name in 1848. Sadly, but so hold on to that thought. That's 1848. Here's 1926. Here's an aerial photograph of land along Ridge Avenue, around Manatawna. The Andorra Shopping Center is not far from where we are. This might be Cathedral. This is like, the Cathedral is like right here. But here is a Schuylkill Center in here. And there is one of our streams is a valley with these wonderful trees. And here's the other stream that has a valley. So where these wooded valleys are, they were hard to log and hard to farm. So that's where some of the best forests are. There's a Schuylkill back here, Ridge Avenue. So 1926, you can see it's in use in that it's agricultural. So Roxborough is not highly developed, but it's not highly natural either. There's a lot of farming going on in Roxborough back in 1926. But then by 1940, like 849, 20 years later, here's a plan that we're going to come across a little bit later for the same property. So suddenly you've got almost a suburban style subdivision going on at the Schuylkill Center. So we go from 1848, almost nothing, to 1926, farms, to 1949, a proposal for a subdivision, and now suddenly it's the Schuylkill Center. So what happened? All right. Buckle your seatbelts, here we go. In 1968, this photograph was taken as the groundbreaking ceremony for the Schuylkill Center's visitor center. And the two women in the center of the photograph are half-sisters. They are descendants, granddaughters of Henry Howard Houston, who's an industrialist, whose name is surprisingly not as well remembered as it might be, although you might know a lot of his legacies. We'll come to that as well. But nonetheless, Henry has a large family. These are two of his granddaughters. They are stepsisters because when Henry's son married, his first wife passed away, he married again, and these are two daughters from each of those two wives. And this is his Henry's granddaughter Margaret, Henry's granddaughter Eleanor. This is Eleanor's husband Sam, and to the right is Margaret's son Henry. So this is the groundbreaking for the Schuylkill Center in 1968, which is one of the first and biggest nature centers in a large American city. It's an incredible sweep of land. And you can see how those 1926 farmsteads are kind of sort of there. This is also in the late 60s. This photograph would have been taken, possibly circa 1970, but not much later than that. That's the visitor center building, which was built in 68. That's one of our reference points. But if you took it, we should get a comparable photograph now. There's a lot more forest now, because now it's suddenly 50 years later than there was here when we're farm fields growing back. So subdivision does not happen. It becomes a giant nature center. This is our old 1970s era logo. Some of you might remember the theta, the Greek letter from ecology flags back in the day. That theta was the first letter in the Greek word ecos, which means home. Ecology and economy are both rooted in the word for home. And so that became the ecology flag, and there's the city and nature reflected in ecology. And look, back then it cost $1 for an adult to walk into the nature center. We're free. We're one of the few things cheaper now than we were in 1970. So there we are. And this is our library in 1968, mid-century modern, very sleek. And if you look at that far corner of the room, there are two portraits on that wall. Hang on to that thought for a moment, because we're going to meet both those portraits in a few minutes. But this is the Nature Center in the late 1960s. And our library was one of the best equipped libraries of a nature center anywhere in the country at that time. So it was quite remarkable. One of my favorite photographs shows, if you know Dick James, our founding executive director. So he joined the center in 1968, retires, I'm sorry, 1965, retires in 96. He's with us for 31 years. Most of us remember Dick as a rather large man. This is a very skinny, very young Dick on the left, talking to, of course, Philadelphia Mayor at the time, Frank Rizzo, around the time the Nature Center opens. So there's Rizzo and two of his buddies at the Nature Center taking their first tour when it's opened. All right, but let's go back to the two half-sisters who are breaking ground here. And notice it's the two sisters who are holding the shovels, not the men, which is great, because the land that becomes the Schuylkill Center is directly donated by each of the sisters. So Eleanor Houston Smith on the left is the donor of the lion's share of the land. Her sister, Margaret Houston Meigs, donates a smaller portion, but a significant portion as well. So the two sisters are holding the spade because it's their family's land, because they're the descendants of this gentleman. This is one of those two portraits in the Schuylkill Center's library, which now you can see in Cathedral Village. It's in a second floor in sort of their atrium space in Cathedral Village. But this is Henry Howard Houston. And Henry was an important industrialist in the late 1890s in Philadelphia. Born in 1820, on the left, that's him in 1840. He's a 20-year-old, coincidentally in 1840 when he's 20 years old. Oh, he's born in Wrightsville, Pennsylvania on the Susquehanna River. So he's not a Philadelphia native, but he's a Pennsylvania native. At the age of 20, he goes up to Clarion County. Now, Clarion County today is in the boonies of Pennsylvania. Clarion County back then must have really been in the boonies, like 200 and something miles north and west of where he is in the middle of the state. And he works for an iron forge, which is owned by James Buchanan, of all people, who goes on, who's a friend of his father, who goes on, of course, to become Pennsylvania's only president of the United States. So that's our claim to fame on the presidents, is James Buchanan, who hires a very young Henry. And on the right is a much older Henry. There are two versions of this painting in Houston family holdings right now. This one was given to me by Binny Meigs, who I'll mention a few times. I mentioned him once before. Binny is great or great-great-grandson of, probably great-great-grandson of Henry, who was on our board of directors, and had these paintings have been passed down. So this is a painting that was commissioned by the family in the early 1900s of a view of Susquehanna from Wrightsville. And if you look in the back on the Susquehanna, you can see a ferry. The Wright family owned the ferry, so Wrightsville is named for the ferry owners. So a small town builds up around them. Henry is a descendant of Wrights, so his mother was a Wright. So Henry's in a well-to-do family in this small town in Pennsylvania. In the foreground, there's a canal, which is built about around there as well. And you can see in the foreground is a person on horseback. So the stories of this are a little bit apocryphal within the family. They're not 100% sure. One version is it was painted like this. Another version is it was painted originally without this, and then the gentleman on horseback was inserted later on. But nonetheless, what this represents is a young Henry standing on the ridge, looking out and contemplating his future and realizing that transportation was the key to things, and that the ferry system, which is linking the world, is going to give way to different technologies, to new technologies. And so Henry moves to Philadelphia, and in 1851, at the age of 31, joins the Pennsylvania Railroad, works in the freight division, and within a few years, he's in charge of the freight division. Really smart guy, must have been really smart, obviously a hard worker, but he rises really fast. And Pensy, of course, is, as many of you know, 30 years ago, I would have said it's the IBM of its time. Now you might say it's the Google or Apple of its time. So the Pennsylvania Railroad was just a dominant industry, not just in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but in the country. So he works for the Pennsylvania Railroad. He does really well. He's an employee for 15 years, and those 15 years are impactful in that the Civil War happens in that time period. And by the Civil War, Henry's in charge of the whole freight division for the Pennsylvania Railroad. So you can imagine what that entailed to move freight during the Civil War. So he's very successful. Originally lives in Center City, but then moves shortly after the Civil War to Germantown. And David Contosa's book describes Germantown then at this time, since there's this new Pennsylvania Railroad is now going up to Germantown, that people can now travel from Germantown into Philadelphia. He calls us the first suburb in the United States. Germantown, he writes, is the first suburb in America. So wealthy Philadelphians began building large homes in Germantown and commuting on this new thing called the railroad to work in Philadelphia. And of course, they took carriage rides often to get to the railroad station, but nonetheless, the commuting begins post-Civil War. It's a rather Italianate house. At the time, this is an 1875 photograph. If you look at the bottom right, you can see what looked like a carriage, but then look at those two things pulling the carriage. This is a small carriage pulled by goats with kids. These are Henry's kids in it. So here's them playing with their goat carriage. But again, there's another legend in the family where Henry is doing incredibly well with the Pennsylvania Railroad. Actually, he leaves the Pennsylvania Railroad after 15 years, just after the Civil War, and begins a number of businesses and begins a lot of investments. And his businesses have lots to do with railroads, but also with steel, with iron, with coal. So he's got his hand and his fingers in lots of pots, and he's doing quite well for himself. And he's amassing essentially a fortune by the 1870s, 1860s, 70s, and so on. So there's that first legend I show where he's looking out and discovers his future. This legend says he's standing in the Widow's Walk and looks west and says, "I want to own everything I can see," because he does begin buying up properties west of Germantown and amasses several thousand acres. And by the time of his death in 1895, he's maybe the largest landowner in the city of Philadelphia. So this is his home, taken in 1875. There we go. In Germantown, 1886. So this is now a few years on. He lives much of his life in Germantown, but then builds Drummoor in 1886, as you can see. And so he's already 66 years old. He left the Pennsylvania Railroad, but became a director of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Always had close ties to the Pennsylvania Railroad. Was a director for his entire life, by the way. So he wasn't an employee anymore, but he was on the board. Builds Drummoor. The Hewitt Brothers. One of the Hewitts was a partner of Frank Furness, legendary architect George Hewitt, and his brother designed this. Gothic revival is one description of it. Boy, it's got a little bit of everything. If you want a turret, you got it. You want a castle, you got it. Want a porte cochere, you got it. So it's just lots of things crammed together. It's all there. It's a remarkable building and a remarkable property. 1886, big formal gardens, as you can imagine, with the pool and all that. So it's just quite the place. And in that time, he begins building other things around him. So remember, 1886 is Drummoor. 1878, he builds Tulpehocken Station. So, and the Tulpehocken Street, so he can actually get easier. He gets a station near his home. It's not unusual for Pennsylvania, people connected to the Pennsylvania Railroad to get stations near where they live if you have that much clout. So he builds this. He's in charge of the project, Chestnut Hill West, which was not called that then yet. It was a much longer name, an independent railroad. He builds it, opens in 1884, and this opens up Chestnut Hill. So this is a very important development in suburban living, or at least in city living in Philadelphia. He builds the Cricket Club. This is the original version from 1884, burns down in 1909, and is replaced by this. So big change, but nonetheless, this is what he built, the Cricket Club. Builds what's called the Wissa Hicken Inn in 1884. It's meant to be a hotel from people coming up from the city they get off at Chestnut Hill, walk down to the inn, stay here, and of course you can enjoy some sort of country time. So Wissa Hicken Inn, that model doesn't last really long, as you can imagine, and it becomes, I'm sure a lot of you know, Chestnut Hill Academy, now Springside Chestnut Hill. But nonetheless, this is its beginning, 1884, which is a big year. Several of these things are happening at the same time. Builds the Church of St. Martin in the field for the Episcopal Church in 1889, and then builds some high quality homes in and around the same section of Chestnut Hill. So he becomes a developer as well. So if you look at a map from this era, you can see that there's a number of things going on. So Henry Howard Houston right here. And then you've got actually the horse show is here first, and the cricket club is here. The Wissa Hicken Inn is down here. Church of St. Martin's in the field is here. And the Wissa Hicken Heights station. So Wissa Hicken Heights was the name that he dubbed this neighborhood. So he's building a little piece of nirvana for himself out here. So, so he's building this section here. And if you look at a Google map from today, you can see a lot of this is still intact, all these, a century later. So there's been some changes, of course, but a lot of the bones of this are still with us. Now, to move forward, a lot of what I got is coming from the Hidden City, Philadelphia article, The Unbuilt Vision for Grand Cathedral Road, written by Bradley Mall, great writer. And this is from 2014, 6 years ago. So I highly recommend it if you can dig this out and read this whole thing. So I want to thank him for doing this. So, so Henry Howard Houston is with the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he has a lot of holdings now in Chestnut Hill, Mount Airy, and he crosses over into Roxborough. And of course, on the other side of the river, on the left, you've got the main line, which we'll come to in a minute. And in between the two are Roxborough. So you've got substantial wealth and resources in Chestnut Hill, substantial wealth and resources on the main line, and Roxborough in between. And so what we're going to see is there are now multiple attempts for the two universes to meet in the middle, to meet essentially in Roxborough. And for just extraordinary luck, or the gods conspiring against them, none of these plans will bear fruit. It's really a remarkable thing. If you believe in parallel universes, in multiple parallel universes, Roxborough looks radically different than it does. So if you like the Spider-Verse in multiple universes, it's we're not here. So let's plow on. So, and look on the other side of the river to the main line of public works, which begins in the 1830s and 40s. And it's a system of this new thing called the train with ferries and things and ways to get goods across Pennsylvania from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. So it's the main line of public works is the name, which has been shortened over time to be the main line, which is the neighborhood west of Philadelphia. But this is the birth of it, the main line of public works. And if you look at this inclined plane, it says near Philadelphia, which is pulling things up the hill. Look, this is ropes. This is not even steam locomotive yet. So this is ropes trying to get this thing, these goods up. So lots of things happening. Ultimately, the main line of public works does not work. The state's not good at initiatives like this. So this is the Pennsylvania Railroad essentially has its birth in some of this. Alexander Cassatt on the main line becomes the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Cassatt name, of course, is well known in the city of Philadelphia and around here. His sister is Mary, the wonderful painter. Mary did this painting of her brother, Alexander. So he's living in Haverford and has a life that's remarkably similar in so many ways to Henry Howard Houston. What Houston is doing in Chestnut Hill, Cassatt is doing stuff very similar on the main line. So for example, not very far within walking distance of his home in Haverford, he builds the Marion Cricket Club with Frank Furness. So this is attributed to Furness, but see the symmetry of that building? Furness was not really that into symmetry. If you look at Furness's best buildings, they're radically asymmetrical. This might be more of a Hewitt kind of drawing, design some people have thought, but nonetheless, Furness the Furness firm builds a cricket club for Cassatt in Haverford, just like we have a cricket club in Chestnut Hill, not far from the home of Henry. So the two of them are talking a lot, and they want to connect these two worlds, in part because you've got all this real estate in between, which is just got to be a great opportunity for them, but also in part, let's face it, if the Chestnut Hill people want to go to an event from a main line person, you can't get there from here, right? There are only two ways to cross the Schuylkill River. One is Green Lane, the other is up in Conshohocken. That was true then, it's still true today. And so they began thinking, well, what if there was another way to get across? And so conversations begin as early as the 1880s for a third way, a middle way to get across the Schuylkill River, which coincidentally would happen to go right through Roxborough. So in March of 1892, the Pennsylvania Railroad approves a plan by Henry Howard Houston to bring the Chestnut Hill West Line, or at least what we now know of that, bring that Chestnut Hill Railroad into Roxborough. It's now going to curve and go into Roxborough. So this is not yet a bridge to connect to the main line, but this is going to have to go over Wissa Hicken Creek, right, to do that. So the footers for this bridge were actually built. This bridge was approved by the railroad. They began construction, and then there was an 1893 collapse in the economy, kind of a mini Great Depression, not well remembered now, but certainly important then. This is a play that came out in 1896, 3 years later, called The War of Wealth. So there was a kind of a mini depression, and it put the kibosh on that. So 1892, they say, yes, let's build this rail line into Roxborough across the Wissa Hicken. 1893, there's a mini depression, and 1895, Henry passes away at the age of 75. This is a statue dedicated to him on Lincoln Drive, right off Lincoln Drive. That's him and his dog. There was a 2-acre plot of land that he donated to Fairmount Park back in the day. It's on that as well. So there's a statue dedicated to Henry, and he does have quite an extraordinary legacy. Henry Howard Houston Elementary School, of course, is named for him. He was on the board of the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf, PSD, and built the original PSD on Germantown Avenue. Huge building, and PSD was there for a very long time. Moved, of course, maybe 30, 40 years ago into Germantown. And I think a large church is there at this point, but nonetheless, he's on the board and contributes and builds the original PSD. Henry's son, also named Henry Jr., goes to the University of Pennsylvania, graduates in 1878, goes to Europe on a trip. As you would do back then, you would go to Europe, see all the sites, and then come back and you're ready to join the workforce or join his father's empire. goes to Europe and unfortunately gets sick and dies there. So Henry Howard Houston dies a year after his college graduation from the University of Pennsylvania. And so Henry builds a student union, Houston Hall, at the University of Pennsylvania, the first student union of a college in the United States. So there's our first student union. And then if you look at a map from that time, you can see here's Henry Howard Houston. So he leaves a legacy of lots of land that is owned by him. Henry Howard Houston along here. In fact, look at this long stretch right here. He wanted this long stretch of land, which coincidentally, this road is now the Schuylkill Center's driveway. George Bunnell over here is Houston's brother-in-law. So his sister marries Bunnell, and he's one of his partners. So every time you see Bunnell on these old maps, it's also owned by, he's like an agent for his friend Henry. And then this is Manitouna up closer to the Wissa Hicken, and here's George Bunnell, Henry Howard Houston. So again, he passes away in 1895, and he's got all this land unspoken for. What happens next? Here's the Houston family tree. And you can see Henry's at the top, and you see him passing in 1895, and he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 children. It's a big family, and multiple generations have 3, 4, 5 children. So lots of heirs. And if you look at this, of course, Cornelia, Eleanor, Sally are all women. And of course, it's 1895. So they're not going to be looked to as the ones who can lead the family business and the holdings. Henry passes away at the age of 21, Henry Jr. So it falls on Sam in 1895 to become essentially the manager of this estate. And he's got lots of heirs and who have needs and wants. So the Houston estate now has a lot of people who have an interest in it, and it's Sam's job to manage the estate for this big sprawling family. Of course, nowadays, it would have been Cornelia who would have been the lead on this, or there would have been a corporation of all the children. And Sam is the second portrait that was first hung in the Schuylkill Center's library next to his dad Henry, and is now to the right of his father in Cathedral Village. So this is a portrait of Sam, who becomes an important player in this story, as we will see, almost as important as his father Henry. And there's younger Henry on the left and older Henry on the right. He also goes to the University of Pennsylvania. The family has a lot of ties to Penn. It's a very important institution to them. That's his this is Sam on the left at his 1848 reunion. So he was, he was active with Penn all the way through. In 1895, not only does Sam Houston's father die, so Henry passes away in 1895, but his first wife passes away within a few months. So within something like 3 or 4 months, Sam loses both his father and his wife. So it was devastating for him. He didn't live in Drummore, but he sort of retreats here with his kids, and this becomes the place where he sort of retreats from the world and tries to figure out what happens next. He eventually does remarry and has children from the second wife, but nonetheless, it took him some time to get his legs underneath him, as you can imagine. But one of the things that he did, this Gothic revival style was wildly out of sync by the turn of the century. So you're going to appreciate this. He gave the house a haircut. So if you go back to this and just sort of, cut this house across the top, you get something like this. So he sort of just shaves the top of this off to become this, which is an amazing thing. Kind of sad now, but nonetheless, there we are. So this is what he did to Drummore. Drummore still exists, is still with us. It has become chopped up into condominiums and has additions to it. Nonetheless, it's still with us. It's still extant as an architectural, as a building. In 1921, Philadelphia is getting ready to pitch the idea of it being the home for the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Sam is a big thinker, as we're going to see, and Sam has big ambitions. And what Sam knows is he has a lot of land, especially in Roxborough, that is unspoken for. What to do with it? So he offers the land around what's now St. John's, the Cathedral. He offers that to be the sesquicentennial site. Philadelphia turns it down. In 1926, the sesquicentennial opens elsewhere, not in Roxborough. But this is one of the big changes that that Sam proposes. That doesn't happen. This is taken in 1926. Coincidentally, this is the sesquicentennial year. Coincidentally, this is the photograph I showed you way at the beginning. So thankfully, there's no, and in the foreground, that's where the sesquicentennial would have been. All that farmland, all those fields in the foreground. You can imagine, you know, it's hard to know what would have happened post that if they had said yes. So that's 1926. But Sam's not done. He hires Paul Philippe Cret, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, another big name architect in the city's history. Cret is the architect for, the designer for the Ben Franklin Bridge, the Rodin Museum, the Walnut Street Bridge, and the Barnes Foundation, just to name a few. So Houston brings Cret in and says, let's work on this. What they come up with, now I know you can't see what all the writing is on this, but I'll explain this in detail. Here's Chestnut Hill on the far right. This red is a lane that goes over the Schuylkill River to the main line. And all the green you can see are all the holdings of Henry Howard Houston in his estate. See all this land here and here. And the purple is what's going to become the cathedral. So hold that thought. We'll come back to that in a second. But this was sold to the Episcopal Academy in 1922, and I'll come back to this. But so now he's going to propose a road that goes from Chestnut Hill across the Wissa Hicken, through Roxborough, across the Schuylkill River to the main line. And this is the proposed Chestnut Hill Bryn Mawr Road and Henry Avenue extended over land of the estate of Henry Houston, deceased. The proposed Chestnut Hill Bryn Mawr Road. And this is a close-up in, and you can see that road in red. You can see coming vertically through the slide, our Ridge and Henry Avenue. You see where they meet. That happens even today. And right at Cathedral is where this would come down. So you've got now this bridge going essentially down the driveway of what's today the Schuylkill Center on a large street that would go over a big bridge to get to Bryn Mawr. And there's the bridge. Cret even designed the bridge. This is the bridge that was proposed in 1926 to go across the Schuylkill River. It's the third way, Conshohocken, Green Lane. Now we got this one. The 1926-27, this bridge doesn't happen either. Why does this one not happen? Oh, sorry. There's the Manayunk Bridge, by the way, as a reference point. So it's something pretty similar in some ways to that. And actually, it's longer and not as tall, but nonetheless, big bridge. The Depression happened. So it's amazing how this happened. So 1893, you've got the run on the banks and this small depression in 1893, and the economy collapses, and that one plan doesn't happen. Here's the Great Depression. This plan disappears in the Great Depression. So again, the family is skunked. But at this time now, you can see this map of this section of Philadelphia. This arrow is pointed to the Chestnut Hill and Bryn Mawr, right, road. Cathedral, in parentheses, Chestnut Hill and Bryn Mawr. All right, there it is down here. And you can see it's not Henry Howard Houston, but Charlotte owns this section. And this is Renfrew Farm number 1. Renfrew, this becomes the Renfrew Center. So the gentleman who founded the Renfrew Center in the 1980s actually approached Charlotte and her daughter and was able to secure this for that nonprofit institution. Sam Houston owns Renfrew number 2. This actually is the farmhouse where the Meigs family is raised, which we'll meet in a few minutes. Henry Howard Houston Estate owns, this is a big Victorian called River House that was on the Schuylkill Center property back in the day. So you've got a lot of holdings of Henry Howard and his family in this area around the 20s. All right. 1922, as I mentioned briefly, Sam sells 100 acres of property right around Cathedral and Ridge to the Episcopal Church, where they want to build, the Episcopal Church wants to build the largest cathedral of the church in North America. This thing would be 1,000 feet long. That tower is 300 feet tall. It's got 12 bells in the bell tower that are made at the same foundry that the Liberty Bell is made. The bells were made. The bells are actually in the basement of the church in storage, is my understanding through readings. That section in that's circled, hang on to that thought for 1 second. I'll tell you about that in a moment, but look at the top right of this slide and you see that traffic circle. So this, imagine this is Ridge Avenue, a tree-lined Ridge Avenue coming down and coming through here. This is Cathedral coming through, and that's Henry going off. So you've got this interesting traffic circle. So we're going to see that in a few minutes. But this is the section of the church that was actually built. And this is the section of the church that actually exists today. So what exists today is, look at, you know, which for many of us is a pretty substantial piece of a church, but look how small a portion. Sam and his wife helped the church build, like his father built St. Martin in the Fields. Sam builds and his wife build this section. This is essentially the apse and the choir section. That's all it was supposed to be of the church. But that's all they're able to help them out with. The church loses interest in its own project. It's also building the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. at the same time. And they decide to put their resources there. And I think they also perhaps were not doing as well financially. And this was the cornerstone of this was laid in 32. So again, it's the Depression. So perhaps they're not doing so well either. So they give up their plan for this ultimately, and it never becomes the largest Episcopal cathedral in North America. And if you look at the back of it, you can see it reads as not being quite finished. They actually default on their loan, on their mortgage, and they give 34 acres back to the Houston family, and in 1979 build Cathedral Village as a way to remain solvent. And Cathedral Village, of course, is attached to St. John's. So that's kind of a little sidebar conversation of something that was going to happen in this sort of whole mega complex here, right above the Schuylkill Center. So this is a different map done by city planners in 1935-36, coming out of the Depression. And this is city planners' take. So Crett in 1926 says, let's put a bridge through Cathedral Avenue and go across to Bryn Mawr. The city planners say, no, let's pull it south. Here's the reservoir. Here's the original reservoir behind Shawmont School. Here's Domino Lane, where the radio towers are today. Radio towers down here. So here's another bridge coming down. So here's yet another iteration of a bridge from the mid-1930s, right around Flat Rock Dam. Look at me, right above and behind Flat Rock, going across to Gladwin. So this one never goes anywhere too. Just before World War II, Sam, still wanting something to happen to his Roxborough holdings, tries to lure the Veterans Affairs, VA, to get their big medical center built on this land as well. They don't bite either. That doesn't happen. But then we get to this. So this I showed you at the top. This is 1948-49, post-war, just post-war. And the Schuylkill Center essentially is buried under this remarkable subdivision with a lot going on. And this design is the brainchild of yet another large named architect who comes into the story, Eero Saarinen, Finnish American architect, who's the designer of the St. Louis Arch, among many other things. That's 1948. And the Tulip Chair to the right. So big name in modern architecture, and of course the Flight Center for TWA, which now apparently has been restored and fronts a hotel. So it's not being used for the original purpose, but this big airy building with these wings, almost like an airplane flying, was quite a remarkable feat of architecture back in its day. So Eero Saarinen comes in. And here are some of the sketches that have been found in the archives of Saarinen and his work, his team's work. And here are two roads coming out of Chestnut Hill, crossing the Wissa Hicken, going through Roxborough. And there's that traffic circle in front of the cathedral. So there's been this notion of a traffic circle floating around for quite a while now. And on the top, there is it again. Here's a sort of blown up. So cathedral coming through, ridge coming through, and Henry coming off. So they see this section of Roxborough now as being a big hub of lots of things going in lots of different directions. So here we are. We have the trustees of the estate of Henry Houston present land for large-scale development in suburban Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. Today, there is a 4 square mile assembled area of unimproved land in metropolitan Philadelphia's northwest. Now, again, this is the plan that Saarinen and his team give to Sam and his family like 1947. Tomorrow, with the natural advantages and the expected metropolitan improvements, it now stands in prospect as the most stable real estate investment in the Philadelphia area. The most stable, there we go. So this is a big brochure that they're giving to investors to invest in this project. Today, natural advantages will attract the top income group of Philadelphia residential buyers. Tomorrow, investment enhanced by a well-designed and protected community. Right. So what they're offering is vision. We are one planner who's going to do all of this. So instead of the city hodgepodging something, we're going to create this in one fell swoop. Today, development problems simplified by being part of a larger scheme. And I'm just showing you the breadth of this. It's really quite breathtaking. Tomorrow, adjacent developments will complement each other, and total site costs will be minimized. And I showed you that arrow in the center of the slide. Above the arrow, there's again that little octopus looking thing, which becomes the hub of all the traffic. And Cathedral Lane Avenue comes down. And they're calling this whole area Cathedral Hills. So before it was Andorra, it's Cathedral Hills, the name that Saarinen christens it, and that the family hopes to shop. And I just love the text of this, and I don't often like to read slides, but the text is just so remarkable, and so it's of such an era. Cathedral Hills has been designed for good urban living. The residential streets are narrow, quiet, and safe for children. Through traffic is routed outside residential areas. The shopping centers will be designed with efficiency and plenty of parking space. Unity of design made possible by single ownership and a calculable need. Each center will serve 1,000 families, will set a tone or character that is impossible in an unplanned development. The schools will be adjacent to the shopping centers, thus bringing the activities of mothers and children, parentheses, the stay-at-homes of suburban life, into focus in one area. Homes were actually within easy walking distance of schools, stores, and transportation. There are pleasant drives through the estate land and the adjacent country. The completion of Cathedral Road and its bridge will make the McCallum Street, Lincoln Drive, Fairmount Park route to downtown Philadelphia readily accessible to Cathedral Hill commuters. So if you live in Cathedral Hills, you would go across the Wissa Hicken and come down to Lincoln Drive. That's kind of how you would go into the city of Philadelphia. So it's quite a vision, quite a sweeping vision. And here's, again, in the brochure, what they have today, which includes all these amenities like the Wissa Hicken, views of the park and St. John's. And tomorrow, we're going to have an expanded church, big shopping centers, brand new schools, and on top right, there's the bridge across the Wissa Hicken, so you can get there. That's tomorrow. And if you can see at the bottom of the slide, this was approved by the city of Philadelphia in September of 1949. So this is one of several plans that actually have been approved by the city and yet again, still not made. And so they kept working on this. And as it unfolded, they kept trying. And you can see here's yet another. Now, if you saw in the Saarinen plans, actually, there was a bridge to the Wissa Hicken, but not yet a bridge to the main line across of Schuylkill. But if you look a little bit later, like in the early 50s, there's that Cathedral Lane octopus, Cathedral Avenue octopus. Look, there's no bridge here. The bridge is now further south. So we saw one bridge going over Cathedral, one bridge coming by Domino, and here's another bridge in between the two. So there's just been so many iterations of what a possible bridge might look like. And here we are. And there's the bridge that would go over Wissa Hicken Creek, which would, have really radically changed our experience of Wissa Hicken today. At about this same time, 1947, 48, late 40s, early 50s, Temple is making noises about moving off of North Broad Street. It feels confined by its space. It wants to move and get some breathing room. Sam is still thinking about what to do with all this property. The Saarinen stuff is coming along, but maybe, Temple University could be lured to come here as kind of a lead tenant for this whole planned subdivision. So he tries to attract Temple University to come to Roxborough, but then the state sweetens the pot and gives Temple money to stay where it is. So that doesn't happen either. And then around the same time, he's trying to attract Temple University, and only a few years after he's trying to attract the Veterans Administration to put their hospital here. The UN has to go somewhere. And Sam and his family are thinking, why not Roxborough? Why not on this land? So again, there are legends in the family. And one of the legends that were passed down to me is that Sam was getting ready to get on a train to go to New York City to seal the deal, to have the United Nations on this land in Roxborough, either where the Schuylkill Center is or a little further up Cathedral. When they get word that John Rockefeller has skunked them by not only offering great real estate in Manhattan, but $8 million on top of it. And that was something that that Sam wasn't going to do. He was going to offer the land, but not the money. Rockefeller gave money and the UN. Can you imagine what Roxborough would be like today if the United Nations, and can you imagine what Philadelphia, there's something kind of intriguing about it, but any open space in Roxborough, of course, would be gone by now. So the UN does not come to Roxborough. It goes to Manhattan. So now we come into the, just around the cusp of 1950, they realize that this is really not quite unfolding. They do build 100 houses. They wanted 5,000. They only build 100. It is called Andorra. At this time, it's not Cathedral Hills. So they begin to adjust their expectations. The Saarinen plan doesn't seem to be gaining any traction, even though I'm not really sure what happened here. It's approved, but I'm not really sure what happened. It just doesn't get any traction. But they do make some changes. And this is Sam in the center, an older Sam. This is our circa 1950, so he's getting on. And this is on Hendren Street. If you've been down Hendren, it links between Ridge Avenue and Hagee's Mill, or gets towards Hagee's Mill. Actually goes towards Spring, actually. And there are some, modest homes along here that actually twins and connect. And he builds this subdivision, and this is him on Hendren Street. This is the people being so happy that he did this for them. So he does some more modest developments, builds the Andorra Shopping Center. Here's a photograph with a clover back in the day. You can date that from the cars. Looks 1970s to me, right? So I remember when I worked for the Schuylkill Center in 1982, I worked there 82, 83, there was a clover in the Andorra Center back at that time. And if you've ever wondered why Cathedral Avenue is like a 4-lane expressway just outside the Andorra Shopping Center. When they build the Andorra Shopping Center, they get ready for what they hope will be this big, they're still dreaming. Let's put this big Cathedral Avenue from the Wissa Hicken to the main line. If this bridge is ever built, we got to have a big road, and they put this piece of it. That's the only piece left. Only piece ever built, only piece that remains. When you drive on it, you're like, what were they thinking? That's what they were thinking. One more time. In the 1950s, Sam passes away in 52. In the 1950s, early 50s, there's one more time by the family to try to do a bridge from Chestnut Hill into Roxborough. This bridge would go almost literally over Valley Green. It's like right here. And the other side of the bridge would come remarkably close to Drummoor, the ancestral family home of the entire Houston clan. So you've got this one more attempt by the family to build a bridge that would go into Roxborough from Chestnut Hill. And go back to the family tree. Henry at the top has a number of children. All the way to the right is Gertrude, his youngest daughter, who we've not mentioned yet. Gertrude marries George Woodward. If you're a Chestnut Hill historian, you know the Woodward name very well. George Woodward is a doctor, a successful doctor, also a politician, has an extraordinary career, becomes a big landholder in Chestnut Hill and a big developer within Chestnut Hill. Woodward Properties is still there. So the Woodwards do a lot of work in Chestnut Hill. So it's almost like Sam is thinking about what's happening with the Roxborough open space. The Woodwards are focusing their attention on the Chestnut Hill community. And what happened is these are the Woodwards. So these are, this is Gertrude and her husband, George. The Woodwards do not want a bridge across the Wissa Hicken that would bring Roxborough too close to Drummoor and come over Valley Green. They just don't like this idea, and they work as hard as they can to essentially quash this idea. This is Charles on the right, son of George, and he's especially adamant, and essentially they work really hard and they kill that deal. And what happens, the offshoot of that is at this time in the 1950s, Forbidden Drive was forbidden with the exception of a section from, you could essentially drive from Wise's Mill Road and go down towards Valley Green. So you could drive in that one section of the Forbidden Drive. And in 1959, that was closed to traffic as well. And they wanted to keep the Chestnut Hill side separated from the Roxborough side. So one of the gifts of this one more attempt to have one more bridge to cross the Wissa Hicken into the Schuylkill gave us a completely forbidden drive and no cars on any of it at all. So the descendants of Henry Howard Houston are a very big group. This is a wedding in 1956 at Drummoor. And these are all the people who have a vested interest in the legacy and in the financial legacy of Henry Howard Houston. So the family has done a lot of work over a lot of years, over many relatives to work a lot of these things out. And one of the upshots is that Roxborough never quite unlocks the way that many people in this family tree want to. And if you can see my cursor, there's a lot of people here. But this is Henry. This is actually, let's see. This is Henry Meigs, who marries, actually, who's the son of Margaret, who is probably one of these two. I'm going to guess that this is Margaret here. But Henry is her son. And I'll show you, he's in that photograph of our groundbreaking. And these are his children across here. And this is Binnie Meigs, who goes on to become president of the board after his father passes away. But anyway, all these heirs have a lot of interest in this. This is Sally, Henry Howard Houston's widow, about a year. You can see she's wearing black about a year after her husband passes away. These are all of her grandchildren at the time around her. And this is Margaret Houston, who marries and becomes Margaret Meigs. And she becomes one of the donors of the Schuylkill Center property. Eleanor Houston Smith is her half sister, who's not in this photo because she's born much later. But nonetheless, this is her when she grows up. She marries Lawrence M.C. Smith, also called Sam by the family. There's a lot of Sams in the family. It's incredibly confusing. Eleanor here has a daughter whose name is Eleanor here. So there's lots of Eleanors in the family. So tracing this family becomes really complicated because there's so many, and so many have the same names. A lot of Henrys in this group as well, as you can imagine. So some names become important in the family, and they keep those names going. 1962, Rachel Carson writes Silent Spring, which essentially launches the environmental movement. The way that I've kind of internalized the story as I've been thinking about it, that it is Henry on the right who would be the person who probably internalizes the message of Silent Spring and realizes that there's this new thing called the environment, and that the preservation of nature is really important. And the family has all this land that in Roxborough that they haven't figured out what to do with. So conversations in the family between Henry, his mother Margaret, her half sister Eleanor, and her husband Sam lead to the founding of the Schuylkill Center. And I would offer that Sam himself is a successful businessman in his own right. He is the founder of WFLN, the old radio station, classical music that was on Ridge Avenue, right? He hires Dick James, our director, to be his weather forecaster. Many people remember even today, Dick James's weather forecast. Everyone always thinks it was on WHLY. It was not. It was on WFLN. Dick would give these really interesting, Dick had a very wicked sense of humor, so he would give his wicked funny essays about the environment and then weave in some weather. He got Best Weather Forecaster from Philadelphia Magazine in 1982. But Lawrence, Sam hired him. Eleanor and Dick had a wonderful relationship. Eleanor and they talked once a week, every week on Monday. They had a conversation. And so she was incredibly involved. Margaret passes away within 10 years of our founding, so she's kind of our silent partner in our founding. But Henry also stays on the board for the next 4 years until his death in 40 years until his death in 2005. So quite a remarkable history of involvement among this family. But here we are in 1926. And in all of these universes, we could have been the United Nations, we could have been Temple University, we could have been the Veterans Administration, we could have been the Sesquicentennial, we could have been a planned subdivision leading to a bridge across the Schuylkill River. There are 3 or 4 iterations of bridges across the Schuylkill Center. Amazingly, none of these happened. And if you go to Google Maps today, here's the Schuylkill Center, there's our visitor center. I mean, there's the Wissa Hicken, of course, this huge swath of green, but you know, the Schuylkill Center just stands out as the largest privately owned, permanently protected open space in the city of Philadelphia. And none of that would have happened if any of these things had happened. So it's quite a story. And the Houstons, both through the Smiths and the Meigs, leave quite a legacy in the region. This is Houston Meadows, for example, a great meadow habitat in the Andorra section of Wissa Hicken Valley. So the legacy that they left behind is amazing. They get a lot of credit for that. But there are so many times this might just never have happened. And for me, as the director of the Schuylkill Center, now that we've been doing environmental education for 50 plus years, I'm glad that these things never happened. And as they say, the rest is history. So I'm going to stop my sharing. And I see all these comments are great. Thank you. Oh, we have a teacher from Houston Elementary. I'm so glad. Attended Springside School. Thank you. Oh, I appreciate all the comments. I'm gonna save all these chats. And there we are. You in? Okay. So, and thank you for helping me fix my slide. So it's 8:15. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I want to thank you for either missing the Eagles pregame or the debate pregame. So you have time for both of those. Next week is a pandemic play. So we have landscape architects talking about how you can play safely with kids during this pandemic. Question is, I zoomed in late. This will be recorded. It is being recorded right now. And we have a YouTube channel for the Schuylkill Center. And actually on that YouTube channel, you'll find other content, including previous Thursday night lives. And this one will be there as well. It'll take a few days to get there, but it's there. So I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. And I hope you come back next week. And I really appreciate your interest in our history. Thank you all. And Sandy, I want to thank you for being our official nodder. All right. Thanks, everybody.